Do you think as a culture, we've just gotten lazier because we just have access to information more readily? Where do you think the lazy thinking is coming from?
That's a great question. I think the lazy thinking is coming from a couple areas. One is that our brains are inherently lazy. And that's not a bad thing, right? We're trying to conserve energy for decisions that matter most. And we pattern match. We look at what the other people are doing. We look for clues for what feels safe based on what others are doing. And so this whole idea of seeing a shiny object and then wanting to chase it, I think the modern day equivalent in business is seeing a competitor or a colleague or a different company doing something and then immediately thinking, oh my gosh, we're behind. We need to be doing that too. Why didn't we think of this? Let's get on it immediately, without really thinking about what are their assets and levers and constraints. What is unique about their situation that allows them to pull this off? You might have similar assets and levers and constraints that allow you to pull this off, or you might not, right? If there is, a creator out there or a business owner and they have a huge audience, they're able to do certain things that you might not be able to with a smaller audience. But let's say you have a stronger community. You are able to do things that they can't, right? Or if you have more capital, you're able to do things that they can't. Or if you have a team of specialists versus their team of generalists or whatever, right? So it's just looking a couple layers deeper to think about what is unique about my situation that allows me to do certain things and gives me a competitive advantage, and not just kind of jumping on whatever is the next shiny object. So, and the shiny object syndrome is one reason lazy thinking happens. And I think the other is rigorous thinking takes practice. It doesn't necessarily come easily. I think a lot of people are excited about trying rigorous thinking, but aren't really sure where to start. So I have a list of questions in an essay that I've written on lazy thinking, 20-some questions that you can ask yourself. So we mentioned a couple here with what's the hard part? What are second order effects? What does success look like? If you were to, instead of jumping straight to prototyping, most people think prototyping is the minimum way that you can try something. If you actually just think about it for 10 minutes, like don't prototype anything yet, don't get your hands dirty yet, just sit and think about how would this actually work? Like if I got approval from my boss right now, what would I do next? What would I do for the next couple of weeks? What would I do between now and this finished project, right? And whatever part that you are unsure about, talk to your boss about. When you bring a more specific question that hones in on a part that you've already thought about a little bit, that actually gives your boss, your partners, your colleagues more ways for them to be thought partners for you. So I think those are two ways that lazy thinking kind of areas where it kind of rears its head and ways that you can combat it.
Yeah, well, I think there's in leadership culture, it seems like you're kind of rewarded for being the loud one in the room with all the opinions. But what I've seen in my career is the best leaders are the ones who sit quietly and then they ask a question and everyone's mind is blown at the end. They're like, oh my gosh, we didn't even think through that. That's a great call out. And so it just brings me back to rigorous thinking is really pointing to important questions to ask ourselves instead of just leaping to action, which is probably our go-to move as a leader. That's why you're there, is you're action-oriented, you can execute, you can get the team to rally around something, but it's so important to sit back and ask those questions. So I want you to help leaders start thinking this way. How can they begin to make this shift from lazy thinking and lean into rigorous thinking?
I think one big way to do that is a little bit indirect, but I think you'll see how it's connected. I think the biggest thing that you can do is have the humility to admit that your initial idea about something, that your thinking might not be as rigorous as it could be. This is actually a lot harder than it sounds, because I think most of us like to think that we are sharp people who know what we're doing. We consider ourselves reasonable. And it can be pretty unsettling for someone to tell you that you're actually not as rigorous as you might think you are. But I think accepting and embracing that there are areas where your thinking might not be that rigorous is the first step. So rigorous thinking isn't a blanket, like, are you rigorous, are you not? It's not binary. There are some areas where you are more rigorous than others. And then there are some areas where you might be newer to the topic, or you might not have thought about it with as much nuance as someone else has. So there are moments all the time where I talk to my co-founders and they point out gaps in my logic. And there are a lot of times when I point out gaps in their logic, or we look at the same primary data, right? We look at the same recording of an interview with a candidate, or we look at the same email from a creator, and we come to different conclusions. And that's a good thing. You want a team where you have people who are seeing different things. You're not all just noticing the same thing, because you can fill in each other's gaps and you can make each other more rigorous. So I love when my co-founders, Shreyans and Goggin, point out, oh, like I'm seeing the same thing as you are, Wes, but here's the conclusion I come to. It's actually the opposite conclusion that you come to. And half the time I think, you're right. Strong opinions loosely held. I give up on mine. I agree with you, right? So this idea of being able to be flexible in the face of incoming information, in the face of new inputs, new data, I think that's very, very important. And I think the other thing is always reviewing primary data yourself. What I mean by primary data, I remember this term, I think I learned it in, social studies or something in, junior high, but I might butcher the explanation, but primary data versus secondary data. Primary data is, chipping away at the fossil yourself, right? You are like there with a brush, working on this fossil. Secondary data is reading notes about the person who is dusting on the fossil and reading about the fossil and looking at photos of the fossil. So primary data is, when I say primary data in a business context, I mean assessing a situation for yourself, not just listening to it or getting a secondary account through someone else. So a lot of times someone, a team member will come to me, for example, and say, oh, I, had this scuffle with a customer or client or with a colleague, and they said this, I said that, and and before I come to a conclusion, I'll say, can you send me the email thread? Can you send me screenshots of what you guys talked about in Slack? I want to see the actual data myself. And there have been times where I have agreed with that person, whatever their account was. And there have been times, many times, where I've come to the exact opposite conclusion, where that person had a certain lens when they were describing what was happening. And in their mind, they were respectful, they were friendly, they were warm, they were justified in saying what they said. And when I saw the actual words that they used, I came to a different conclusion and said, this did not come across the way that you thought it came across. And I will explain to you why. So that's the other part of rigorous thinking is once you look at the primary data, and if you have a certain hypothesis or perspective, being able to explain why to the other person. You want to explain why so that they can then come back and say, oh, Wes, actually you missed this thing, right? Maybe I missed something and then I changed my mind, right? But if I'm talking to a direct report and explaining why what they thought was warm and respectful didn't actually come across that way, I want to be able to point to specific words where, you said this thing and that sounded a little bit abrupt, or this person, the person you were talking to was trying to give you a bid. They were giving you an opening. They were trying to make peace with you. And you kind of slapped down that bid when you replied with this thing, right? So I want to break down the line by line of here's exactly how the conversation happened as you're showing me in your screenshot so that we can both learn from it. And you can learn how to, translate your intent more accurately with words, right? And so it becomes a learning opportunity for everyone involved. And so that levels up the rigor for the entire team.